Good afternoon, everyone. My name's Dana White. Welcome to the Myth Salon on Monsters. I have been looking forward to this for quite some time. When we first conceived of having the Myth Salon on Monsters in October, I found out that the University of California at Santa Cruz was having a festival on monsters. And I have never been more impressed with a 3-day conference. I mean, the quality of the speakers, the quality of the organization, the staging, you just had to have been here. I mean, it was just fabulous from the time I got there until midday on Sunday. So what I'd like to do is, as I do in the Myth Salon, I would like to open it up with a ringing of the singing bowl. And I have two things I'd like to invoke in terms of silence. And the first is the situation in the Middle East. It is just tragic what is happening. The second is this situation in Maine with this shooter that went berserk and is killing these people. These are both monstrous situations, and I'm hoping that maybe through our discussion today that we can make some sense of these tragic affairs. So before we begin, let's have a little moment of silence. I have a poem that I'd like to read, and it is called Monstrous. I see the hideous face and turn away into my own world, feeling myself shrink in the process, small, reduced, as if a vice presses upon my temples as the myth of self-reference forms. I find myself compelled to confront the fear of my failure to comprehend, my inability to find compassion for others. Is it the freedom of the other that cages me? I feel everything outside me tangles into knots, something monstrous gestating inside me, twisting the umbilical cord of my mind's thoughts as if my warped sense of self is struggling to become alive. Impatient and intolerant of others, I desire connection, but struggle to come to grips with my critical nature of the outside. Who am I to subject anyone or anything to my perceptions? Invisible threads wrap me in cocoons of self-ratification. What I see is not monstrous. What I experience about others is not worthy of fear. What I fear is myself. By bending the world to my will, I become a lonely god lording over a world to which I am indifferent. I have rendered existence as lifeless as an empty conch shell, poised for me to take up residence, but only when I am ready to dissolve my calcified self. I now know what I must do. I must love what is monstrous in me, breathing life and love into what I fear. What I fear I must face on my own, my insularity. The monster I have birthed is I calling me toward eternal uniqueness, letting everything come forth as my equal. I must not turn away. I must free myself from my judgments. I must sing my monster forward and greet the world as it is. The monster transforms into love, flowing into oneness with reality independent of my judging, in spite of all the disguises I give the world to make it agreeable to me. So welcome, everyone. Again, let's turn it over to Will. Will, why don't you launch and get things going?
Oh man, I think you got things going. That was a powerful poem. Thank you, Dana. Before we do get fully started, I want to call out Corinne Bordeaux, who we're missing tonight. This is a conversation. This is an event that she's been wanting to be involved with and help put together for a long time. I remember conversations. We almost put together a Pacifica film festival right before COVID. And this was a big focus and a big focus of Corinne's. So I know she was a big part of this and a big part of this coming together. And it's sad that she's not here because she's not feeling particularly well tonight. So if you're out there tonight, Corinne, love you and thank you for helping put this together. You know Dana White, host of the Myth Salon, contributing faculty to Pacifica's Myth degrees and author of numerous volumes of mythology. I'm Linn, founder of mythhouse.org and moderator of our evening, head mythologist for Fascinated by Everything, and a meta expert for a television series for ZDF, Sky, and History Channel called Myths, the Greatest Mysteries of Humanity. We're joined as usual by our friend, Dr. Dennis Patrick Slattery, who's an expert on what may be America's greatest monster, Moby Dick. He's a distinguished emeritus professor in the Mythological Studies program at Pacifica Graduate Institute. Dennis is the author, co-author, editor, or co-editor of 33 volumes, including 7 volumes of poetry and 1 novel. Most recent titles include The Way of Myth, Stories, Subtle Wisdom, and The Fiction and Our Convictions, Essays on the Cultural Imagination. You can find more on Dennis at DennisPatrickSlattery.com. Hi, Dennis. Thanks for being here.
I'm just so honored to be here. And you know, that word monster, 2 words, and monstrous, just really evoke fantasies in me, and I don't think I'm alone. So I'm just so grateful to be here tonight to get some boundaries for myself around what can be called monstrous and what can be called a monster, and maybe where the term is just not being used in the right way. So I'm ready to learn.
Thank you, Dennis. And for me, you know, what it's like to be called a monster and the feelings on all sides of this equation of the monstrous. Maria, great to be back with you. Maria is an expert on myth and fairy tales who served as a dean and chair of the Committee on Degrees in Myth and Folklore at Harvard University, author of several annotated books of fairy tales and a number of volumes on their dark sides, especially in relation to the feminine. Maria is joined for conversations about myth and film and to discuss her most recent book, Heroine of 1001 Faces. Hi, Maria.
Hello, and it's great to see all of you. Thank you for inviting me to be part of this. And today I have been haunted by Shakespeare. Do you remember Prospero? This thing of darkness, I acknowledge mine. And so that is what has captured my imagination today, thinking about the darkness within each of us.
I'll have to write that down in just a moment. Thank you. And now I get to introduce Michael Chemers, who's going to introduce Renee Fox, Camilla Hawthorne, and Elizabeth Swensen from the UC Santa Cruz faculty. Thanks for being with us, Michael. Michael Chemers founded the production dramaturgy program at Carnegie Mellon University School of Drama. He is a professor of dramatic literature and theater arts and the chair of the Department of Performance, Play, and Design at the University of California, Santa Cruz. His works include The Monster in Theater History, This Thing of Darkness, and Staging Stigma, a critical examination of the American Freak Show, which won the ATHE Outstanding Book Award, was an honorable mention in 2009. Thank you for being with us. As we mentioned, we've been looking forward to and interested in this conversation for a long time. So please take us away and we'll look forward to joining in soon.
Thank you so much, Will, and Dennis and Maria and Dana. We're so happy to be here. I was very, very happy to meet Dana last week or 2 weeks ago at the Festival of Monsters that we held at UCSC, as he explained. We're very honored to be a part of the Myth Salon, and we're very happy to share with you a little bit about what we're going to be doing. With me today, I'm very honored to be able to introduce Elizabeth Swensen, who is a professor in the games program, Art, Games, and Playable Media. I am also here with Renee Fox, who is a professor in the literature program the author of the book, The Necromantics, Reanimation and the Historical Imagination in Victorian, British and Irish Literature. And I'm also very happy to introduce Camilla Hawthorne. And Camilla Hawthorne is a professor of sociology here at UC Santa Cruz as well. Her books include The Black Geographic, Praxis, Resistance, and Futurity, Contesting Race and Citizenship, Youth Politics in the Black Mediterranean, and The Black Mediterranean, Bodies, Borders, and Citizenship. So thank you so much to my colleagues from the Center for Monster Studies for coming. And if you will indulge us, I've got a little presentation that I'd like to share with you about what we do and who we are and what we hope to achieve in the world. And then it's a very short presentation, and then we'll just open it up, and I suppose we'll hear from my colleagues, and then whatever you guys normally do here at the Myth Salon. So I am the founding director of the Center for Monster Studies at UCSC. The Center for Monster Studies is an interdisciplinary research group. We're composed of professors from across the disciplines, which I will talk about later, which definitely goes to show that monster studies is no longer a, well, I suppose you could say in the 1990s when it was first invented by Jeffrey Jerome Cohen, or the field was first established by Jeffrey Jerome Cohen with his book Monster Theory and his essay Monster Culture 7 Theses, that monster studies at that time was a subfield or a sub-inquiry of multiple fields. And now it's really starting to gain its own credence, its own street cred, as it were, as a discrete field of inquiry, which touches many, many different disciplines. So when we talk about monsters, I think this is a question that Daniel was interested in learning more about. Monster studies is very clear that monsters have only cultural bodies, that they don't have physical bodies. So when we call someone a monster, or when we talk about conditions or people as being monstrous, that's actually a terrible mistake that we make, because monsters' bodies are purely cultural. However, it is a process that is extremely common, and we're going to get into some of the pernicious attitudes and aspects of that process in this presentation. But I like to tell my students that if a real werewolf were to walk across the quad, then that's not really my problem anymore. That's the problem of a biologist, or possibly a manufacturer of extremely expensive ammunition. Seriously, have you priced silver bullets lately? They are very expensive. I looked it up. It's really no joke. But we're interested in monsters as they manifest in cultural products. So let me lay it out for you the way that we sort of articulate this issue. We live in a time right now of extraordinarily increasing marginalization, ostracization, and persecution of people who are identified in particular ways as minority with minority identities, even though that's a misnomer. They are often not minority identities, but when I say minority identity, I'm talking about a group that does not have the cultural power to represent itself in the ways that are most comfortable for them. So this is a growing problem. I believe I read that this year hate crimes in the United States were up by more than 1,000%. This is not a joke. And since 2016, the hate crimes have been rising in a particularly precipitous fashion, which is extremely disturbing. But I think things are really, really in the last few months have been quite dire. And we believe in monster studies, we recognize that this kind of marginalization and persecution is due in part to powerful stories that we tell ourselves within our culture about monsters. Obviously, what the process is, I call this the dark art. The process is that you take a monster, which is a cultural entity, and you map that monster, you project that monster onto real people. You can then generate the conditions that are necessary for committing atrocity against that person, or persecution or marginalization. that's how you do it. I happen to be of the belief that human beings don't do terrible things to other human beings, and so they, generally speaking, a normal person is an empathic person. A normal person is a kind person. I believe that. That may not be true, but you have to monsterize people before you can commit atrocities against them. You have to believe that the person that you're doing this to is not really human. So that is the process of monsterization as we see it in monster studies. However, the good news is that these tropes can also be inverted, subverted, and converted into acts of resistance against persecution, marginalization, and ostracization. And the reason why is because, and I believe this was captured very beautifully in Dana's poem that he read at the beginning of the session, which is that if you can look at the monster and see yourself, you are standing on the precipice of genuine self-growth, psychological growth, self-discovery, and it can be quite profound. And I think a lot of us have had experiences where when we identify with the monster that we're looking at, we actually learn a lot about ourselves rather than looking at the monster and seeing the other and then identifying that person for persecution. So we believe that the University of California, Santa Cruz must understand monster culture and support acts of playful and performative resistance for two reasons. One is to understand the process by which people are othered and monsterized and therefore endangered, but also the tropes that we can employ that would generate resistance, that would generate empathy, and that would generate compassion also through monsters. So it's a double-edged sword. To give you an example, I want to share with you a monster that was particularly important in my research. I happen to be Jewish, and I grew up in Salt Lake City, Utah, which was a very strange place for a Jewish kid to grow up. And they would ask me things like, "Where are your horns?" You know, and "Is it true you have black blood?" They would ask me questions like that. Other children at the time. And of course, at the time, I didn't realize that there was any element of that was not personal, but now I recognize that I was being monsterized, quite literally. So I want to share with you a particularly pernicious character, which is really a monster from medieval folklore that got appropriated by the Nazis into a very hateful image. And this character, this monster, is the Wandering Jew. So here is an image of the Wandering Jew as it appeared in an art exhibit in 1937 in Munich, I believe. You can see the sign there that says Der ewige Jude, which means the eternal Jew, the eternal Jew. And you can see here that the Jew is this monstrous figure, ostensibly, who was alive at the time that Christ was being crucified and told a joke at Christ's expense, and was therefore cursed to wander the earth as an immortal being until such time as Jesus sees fit to return. So the Wandering Jew was actually, in European folklore, was a figure of compassion, and people would leave out bread and milk for the Wandering Jew and so that he could continue his wanderings. And they saw him as a figure to be sympathized with and not to be exploited. But the Nazis, their propaganda machine, turned the Wandering Jew into this character. And as you can see, if you look at the elements that make up this monster, you can see that there is a prodigious nose, of course. That's classic when we're stereotyping Jews, prodigious nose. But you'll notice also a protruding lower lip, if you can see that. A scraggly black beard, exaggerated ears, a beetling brow, an Asian-style hat, an Eastern-style hat, a kaftan in this case. Also, the Jew is hunched over. The Jew is carrying money, which occupies all his attention. And the Jew is also possessed of a map. In this case, it's a map of Germany, but as you can see, it's stamped with the hammer and sickle of communism. And so here, the Nazis are portraying the Jew as an agent of Russian communism to be fought against. It's a wonderful, wonderfully paradoxical state of affairs that Jews are considered to be both agents of communism and agents of rampant commercialism. But that's just one of those things that we see when we hit around with monsters. It's like those lazy immigrants who are stealing our jobs. What did you say? But moving on to a little bit later, an incarnation of this Jew, of this monster in a Russian context. So as you can see here, the Jew is now sitting on a pile of skulls, which is just to drive the point home. The caption says, "Yid, the people of contagion." Yid, the people of contagion. And as you can see, he's got the ridiculous nose. He's got a protruding lower lip, the beetled brow, the scraggly black beard, the exaggerated ears, the Eastern hat, and of course, he's obsessed with a pile of money that he's got, that he's looking at here. You can also see a representation of the territory that the Jew has conquered in the background, which I imagine is some part of Russia. And you can see there's an apocalyptic sky with a sun rising as a Jewish star. Well, now you may recognize, and I think that you do, that this image of this way of depicting Jews was considered after World War II to be extremely hateful, hostile, anti-Semitic, and it's just not done anymore, right? We just do not portray Jews this way unless you are really trying very hard to be anti-Semitic, right? So you do see the wandering Jew, the eternal Jew, as a monster on certain hate-filled websites. But on the whole, we don't see it in mainstream culture anymore because of how hateful it is. What then are we to make of this image from 2003? This is an image from 2003, and as you can see, it's from the Toronto Sun. And as you can see, it depicts Osama bin Laden, who at that time was being hunted for his role in the 9/11 disaster. But if you look very carefully at this image of Osama bin Laden, you can see the traits that belong to the monster, the eternal Jew: the nose, the lip, the beard, the ears, the beetled brow, the Asian hat, the money, and the map. It's all there. All the elements are there. So what do we make of this? I think what we're looking at here is a very, very old hatred that can be very, very cosmetically, very superficially drafted to contain hatred and fear for the monster du jour, whoever that's going to be. So how do we fix this? How does the arts and humanities respond, and social sciences respond to this sort of thing? Well, we believe that arts and humanities are the best system for addressing this kind of hatred and lack of empathy. So we create thank you, Elizabeth. We create the Center for Monster Studies specifically to be a research clearinghouse. Initially, it was for professors in UCSC exclusively to share their research about monsters, which it turns out we do a great deal of work on monsters here at UCSC. And a number of classes at UCSC are taught that involve monsters across the disciplines. Although I have to say that Dr. Fox, who's going to be speaking later, teaches most of them all by herself. So it was initially designed to be a place of community for UCSC scholars. However, in 2019, we created a little mini conference, which we called FrankenCon, which was designed to commemorate the 101st anniversary of the publication of Frankenstein by Mary Shelley, by bringing together UCSC scholars and area scholars to talk about Frankenstein and how it impacted their work. And also we watched Frankenstein and the Bride of Frankenstein from the 30s with scholarly commentary, which was a lot of fun. The following year, we hit COVID, so we didn't do anything until 2022. But in May of 2022, we had our second event, which we called the Festival of Monsters. And this was much more expanded. We had, in the meantime, gone to the Office of Research at UCSC and asked for seed funding to create the official Center for Monster Studies, so that we're not just, whistling in the wind, but we actually have a center, a research center. And to no one's greater surprise than mine, we got the money. It was a tremendous surprise to me that anybody would find this to be worthwhile. But the truth is that we don't have to convince people anymore People are very intuitive about this. I think that the people look at this and they say, oh, monsters, what's that? I'd like to know more about that. What are you doing with monsters? How can that be serious work that scholars do? And then they look at us and they see that we are serious about monsters. We also hold the third year was of the Festival of Monsters was 2023. We just finished it October 13th through 15th, 2023, and it was much larger than ever. And this was the first time that we put out an international call for papers, and we got responses from far-flung places like Brazil, India, Turkey, and Germany. And so we had scholars coming from all over America and all over the world to participate in this event. So we are reaching out to the larger monster studies community, and we are finding ourselves strong and in need of community. We also do a writing contest every year where students in the literature program can write a horror story and get recognized by the Center for Monster Studies for that process. We do a podcast called The Show Where They Talk About Monsters, which I recommend to everyone. I think it's actually pretty good. It's short and funny. And you can get it anywhere where you get podcasts. It's on all the websites and systems and whatever it is where you get, I don't even know. But The Show Where They Talk About Monsters. We also Renee Fox and I created last year an Exhibiting Monsters course. And this was designed to begin the process of creating an exhibit that was at a museum here in Santa Cruz, the Museum of Art and History, specifically on comic books that feature monsters in them, which I'll talk more about in a minute. We also have an interdisciplinary faculty research group, which studies monsters as they appear in cultural products like video games and other digital media, tabletop role-playing games, which is one of the fastest growing areas of culture right now, and of course, films, plays, comic books, novels, you name it. You name it, we pursue it. And then also we have been engaging in fundraising and other kinds of collaborations within campus and beyond campus as well. This is just an incomplete list of the departments that are represented by faculty who are members of the Center for Monster Studies: performance studies, game studies, literature, film, sociology, feminist studies, trans studies, history, computational media, which are the engineers, and critical race and ethnic studies. We have not yet brought in the hard sciences guys. We're hoping to bring them in pretty soon. I think we can when we start talking about AI and other things that are getting monsterized in our culture right now, we may have a way in to talk with them, with the computer scientists. But also, a lot of monsters arise from the anxiety of climate change. So I think that we can bring in some environmental scholars as well. So one example of what we did was the Exhibiting Monsters class, which was attached to this production that we did with the Santa Cruz Museum of Art and History. This was a museum exhibit, which is still on display. So if anybody's in Santa Cruz, please drop into the Museum of Art and History until January 20th, I believe. It's still going to be up there. Of comic books that feature monsters that were drawn by women, starting in the 1940s and going all the way to yesterday. So we had a really great time with this. We really looked at the way that women artists used monsters and other kinds of horror tropes throughout the process of the American century, of the last century, to generate subversive, sometimes proto-feminist or subtly feminist ideas about using monsters as a way of conveying those ideas. So this is a lot of fun, and we worked very hard on it. So please do come and see it if you can. We had a great time working on it. As I said, the festival, which is now an annual event, 3-day event featuring scholarly panels, public events, including mask demonstrations. And we had a great day of, we brought in experts from a wide variety of different venues and cultural studies centers, including Black Nerds Create, which is a group of African-American women who are nationwide now. They were located in the Bay Area once, but now they're nationwide, African-American women who particularly study race as it appears in science fiction and fantasy culture. We had a performance events. We did 2 staged readings of brand new plays that were full of monsters, which is really fun. And then, of course, we had the Monsters Ball, which was a masquerade party that we had on October 14th. Dana, I can't remember what monster you went as to the Monsters Ball. You didn't make it? Oh, I'm sorry. I'm sorry. And that's really what we do. That is what we do. And I think that it's very important to emphasize that we are the only ones who are doing this. Right now, there is only one Center for Monster Studies, and it's at UCSC. And I think that we are beginning to become the center for serious scholarship about monsters worldwide. So how do we know we're succeeding when we approach this? Well, we take feedback from folks who went to the festival. And I'm very happy to say that, like Dana, a lot of people had a good time at the festival this year, and we really were able to create a lot of community and share a lot of really interesting ideas. We got write-ups in the media this year from a lot of local media, but also we got some national press. We were featured in Forbes magazine this year, which was a big surprise to us, but it was true. We are developing enthusiastic partnerships within the UC, not only within UC Santa Cruz, but across the UCs now. We've created a research group called Monsters in Technology that involves professors from many, many different UCs and beyond. And we're creating partnerships now with other universities across America and across the world. We have some interesting testimonials from alumni who they said, I wish that this program had existed when I was a freshman. We got a wonderful endorsement from Jeffrey Jerome Cohen, who was at the festival last year in 2022. That was a great honor to have him, and a tremendous amount of student engagement that we've been having. So where are we going from here is the next question. We want to continue to engage with the issues of persecution and resistance that are the foundation of monster studies. We are trying to coordinate even more research among even more faculty in the university, in the UC system, nationally and internationally, and interplanetarily if we can get the connections. We want the Festival of Monsters to be even bigger. It's about as big as we can make it right now, but we want it to be bigger. We want it to involve more people, maybe even go over more days. We're going to have to find a conference hotel though, because I think we're sort of operating by the seat of our pants right now, and it's been I'm glad that Dana had a good time, but it was a lot of logistics. And then most importantly, we're trying to work to change the discourse about monsters and monstrousness throughout the academy, and to reach into pop culture to the extent that we're able, which includes being able to reach out to alumni who work in entertainment and media and talk to them about these issues. So UC Santa Cruz has a lot of very interesting alumni who work in science fiction and fantasy realms, and we're reaching out to them to talk more with them about how they can partner with us. We are hoping to establish the first Monster Studies Journal, which would make UCSC the central clearinghouse for monster studies in the world. We're hoping to establish a fund that will drive our festivals going forward. We're hoping to develop a full-time center staff. Next in our line of hopeful things that we're trying to do is to create a minor so that you could major in literature and minor in monster studies at UCSC. And we're developing a graduate research cluster right now. And I see that I've gone for 22 minutes, so I'll wrap it up here. But I'm sure that there's going to be plenty of opportunity for members of the salon to ask us questions. And I'd like to ask my comrades who have come with me to comment on what they think is important and where the center is going. So I will shut up now and turn it over to my colleagues.
Hi, everybody. Thank you, Michael, so much for giving such a wonderful overview of the kind of work we're doing. So just a couple of things that I wanted to add and expand on. The thing that I think was particularly unique about about what we did this year in the way that we expanded into the 2023 Festival of Monsters and the museum exhibition that we put together, is that this year we were really, really focused on finding points of intersection between scholarly work and public-facing work. The exhibiting monsters class that Michael and I taught together was specifically focused on that. So it was, it was about working with students to have them figure out how to translate their academic projects, their scholarly research, their scholarly writing into something that was, was important and translatable to people outside of our, our little 15-person classroom. So, to work with students to think about how to take the scholarly obsessions that we all have and make them meaningful in wider ways. And so during our festival this year, we had both these public-facing events and a scholarly conference, and people came to both of them, and people talked across this this line that is usually a pretty solid solid line. And one of the things that feels so important and valuable to us about studying monsters, about having a Center for Monster Studies, is that monsters, maybe more than anything else, really allow us to cross that line, really allow us to, to think with people that we might not otherwise be able to think with when we're, locked away at UCSC. Because monsters matter across cultures and across times. Everybody has experience with monsters in some way or another. Everybody has ways to talk about them. Everybody has passionate ideas about them. And so monsters become a really useful kind of language that everybody can speak together, a kind of common language. And that is something that has been really important to us.
Dr. Hawthorne?
Sure. Hi, thank you for having me. Thank you for inviting me. So I am trained as a geographer. I'm in sociology department and critical race and ethnic studies, and I frequently describe myself as the uncool social scientist who has very cool art friends. So I'm just very grateful that I get to hang out with all of you. I don't have a background in monster studies, and in fact, I think that I was plugged into these conversations because I played Dungeons and Dragons with Elizabeth and Michael. And we found out through these amazing experiences. I started playing Dungeons and Dragons on Zoom with them during the pandemic. I'm a lifelong nerd, so it's very surprising to me that I never had the opportunity before 2020 to play. But through our experiences, right, of, developing these fantasy worlds together, realizing that we shared so many similar interests in terms of using our fascination with speculative fiction as a way to think about the world. And so, even though I don't have a background in monster studies, I've, as someone who grew up watching Star Trek, on the couch with my dad and, was obsessed with dragons and wanted to become a dragon rider, right? It's sort of force of habit that I've always used speculative fiction, science fiction, fantasy worlds as a way to think through politics, right? And, this is something that I spoke about during the Black Nerds Create panel at Monster Fest. But, particularly for those of us who are, the descendants of enslaved people, the descendants of colonized people, we know that speculative fiction has always been about race, about oppression, about colonialism, right? These themes, right, of monsterization, oppression, colonization, abduction, enslavement, experimentation, right, are, standard, like boilerplate themes in science fiction. And so, whether it is explicit or not, whether it's operating at sort of the level of the subconscious or as an explicit form of social critique, these genres have always been about sort of diagnosing problems of inequality and oppression in our society. One resource that I've particularly loved is a collection edited by Adrienne Marie Brown and Lolita Imarisha called Octavia's Brood, because they actually would have writing workshops with activists, sort of using the work of Octavia Butler, and then, having activists, oftentimes people who did not necessarily see themselves as creative writers or as fiction writers, writing science fiction stories as a way to think through contemporary social movements. And so, one last thing I'll say, you know, I teach a class on policing and prisons and abolition in the sociology department, but in the first week of the class, I have my students read works of speculative fiction, precisely because I think what these genres do, and particularly monster stories, is they take our world and they render it slightly unfamiliar, just enough that things we take for granted about our society and how it functions sort of pop into the foreground in ways that then get us to think about our world in different ways. And so that's what I found so generative about being in these spaces with Renee and with Elizabeth and with Michael.
Thank you, Camilla. I'll ask Elizabeth to speak, Elizabeth Swensen.
Absolutely. As someone who makes games in a scholarly context, I think about play as both an invitation and an action vocabulary. And when you're dealing with monsters, you often can be the monster, and you think about the actions we allow monsters to have in interactive media. But more often, we are confronting a monster, and how that monster is depicted runs into some of the same problems we see in other visual media or in written media. But similarly, the actions we are allowed to engage with when a monster is identified and appears often is a very narrow vocabulary, and it doesn't have to be that way. And so when I teach game design, I'm thinking about why we identify certain shapes and cultural artifacts as monsters. And when students are trying to design moments of opposition, why are they leaning on certain kinds of tropes that they see? What other things do those tropes evoke? And how can we problematize those tropes and maybe use the opportunities of role-playing and play in general to explore issues of monstrosity? One work that Michael and I are slowly chipping away at is thinking about how to use tabletop role-playing games like Dungeons and Dragons as a way to identify more scary parts about our everyday lives and confronting them within the realm of fantasy, studying sort of the strategies of fascism, how they pop up and how those strategies monsterize creatures and people in our case. But in Dungeons and Dragons, we think about investigating the quest giver. If someone says, go into the basement and kill these monsters that have been getting in my way, how can we ask the player to stop and question that motivation, that framework, and what proof do we have of monstrosity? Is the monstrosity a real thing? And why are we taking this quest? Who's giving it?
Exactly.
What's their motivation? And so thinking about using real world scholarship about fascism to create a framework to have players be able to engage with, identify these strategies, and hopefully be able to apply them in real life. Hopefully they won't have to, but unfortunately they have to.
Thank you so much, Elizabeth. Dana, turn back to you, or Will?
Yeah, well, first, I think all of us want at least a moment before talking about monsters just to applaud what all of you have done and what you've done together, and to just share some awe. It's really wonderful. You're looking at a lot of administrators. All four of us that you're meeting tonight have been academic administrators. And so what y'all are doing is miraculous and beautiful. And I think it's amazing that you've found support for what you're doing, and you found support in each other, and you found an amazing place to push, you know, to dig into a little Achilles heel. And I think that's just awesome. And that you're bringing people together to do it and I know I'm not the only one. And if I have to, you know, do we want to take a moment, Maria, Dennis, just to say, I think it's worth commenting on how amazing it is what you're all doing together.
Mm-hmm.
So a couple of things, and it's just wonderful because this is a whole area of mine that is new, or your inflection, I think, is new. You know, Joseph Campbell would speak about metaphors as transport vehicles. That is, it allows us to get into the car and be transported from the familiar to the unfamiliar. And then we get out and we're in a whole new galaxy. And I heard that journey in a couple of your talks. What I love about what you're doing is that you're giving the world a new transport vehicle to get into, and then to move, and then to get out and say, wow, this is an unfamiliar terrain. What's going to happen here? And what I like about it is it throws us into uncertainty. And so we've got to risk something now because we don't have that safe ground, maybe of our own disciplines. So that's one. Michael, I want to ask you this, and I may be, let me just ask it because I may have misunderstood it. Early on, you made the point of how we can make an individual or a class or a race non-human. And then you said, so what do? We turn them into monsters. And my question is that the only option? I mean, we can, please.
No, go ahead. Continue.
So, I get it and I agree with that, but I think, are there other ways that people are diminished, trivialized, made invisible,
Sure,
non-existent? And so I'd love to have you comment on that.
absolutely. I think that's a very insightful question, Dennis. Thank you so much. No, monsterization is just one way that you can other people, that you can, as you say, diminish them, reduce them, and set them up for persecution. It just happens to be a way that is particularly prevalent in our culture, I think. And it's what fascinates me when in my research. So that's really what I focus on. But no, absolutely not. It is certainly not the only way that you can make someone powerless within this framework. I see Camilla is nodding a lot. Do you want to respond to that, Camilla?
Yeah, I was actually just, so I'm teaching a class this quarter called Migrant Europe. So I'm a scholar of Black Europe. I look at, the Black diaspora in Europe, and particularly at the children of African immigrants who were born and raised in Italy. And so the question of monsterization, right, is really important when we talk about Europe, where we have, these many historical legacies that are sort of coming together, right? Whether it's, the Inquisition, and then later the Holocaust, right? Or the expulsion of the Moors, the legacies of slavery, to the extent that, David Thiel Goldberg kind of talks about Jews, Muslims, and Black people as kind of these three categories of otherness against which the idea of like a white Christian European civilization is formed. And so we were talking about this with my students last week, and I had them look at, there's this famous engraving of Amerigo Vespucci, quote unquote, discovering America. Stuart Hall also uses this when he writes about the West and the Rest. And it's this fascinating pedagogical tool, because on the left-hand side, you have this figure, right, of the European explorer holding a sextant and a compass, right, and a cross, and then a sailing ship behind him, right, as a symbol of masculinity, active power, technology. And then the right side of the engraving shows an ambiguously gendered nude indigenous person reclining in a hammock, surrounded by animals. So there's also this sort of this juxtaposition, right, of indigeneity and animality. And then in the background, you see more indigenous people gathered around a campfire where various body parts are being roasted. And I think that's sort of an example of many different forms of otherization, right? There's the kind of monsterization in the form of the cannibalistic savage, but also the stereotype of the noble savage as well, which is a very different kind of trope that is also deeply dehumanizing, but that's based on a form of romanticization of the other that is nonetheless sort of denying of full humanity. Something else that that has really been on my mind, that it's slightly unrelated, but I just, thinking about monsterization, and I feel like we can't have this conversation without also talking about what is happening in Gaza right now, and thinking about the explicitly monsterizing language that is used to justify the flattening of Gaza. So I just want to read. So this is an excerpt from a statement that Netanyahu made on October 16th. This is a struggle between the children of the light and the children of darkness, between humanity and the law of the jungle. And then on October 9th, Israel's defense minister also announced that they are fighting human animals and that they will act accordingly. So, if we're thinking about all the different ways that we see monsterization show up even right now in this moment, and again, thinking about, the monsterization of Jews and the Holocaust, and then the monsterization of Palestinians, right, and this ongoing genocide that's happening in Gaza as well.
Yeah, you really make it so clear how monsterizing is a form of framing. And if I can get, I beg your pardon, if I can get the frame around this group or this culture or this individual, then I can pour anything into it, and the frame is going to dictate its definition. Yeah, so really helpful to hear you, Camilla, and Michael. Thank you.
Gosh, I think we could call this session "The Monster with 1,000 Faces." Michael, I was fascinated by the way that you talked about how the monster keeps migrating and morphing into new versions of itself. So we have kind of the eternal monster. So my question will be, will the monster ever disappear, or are we destined as humans to always need a scapegoat? I mean, here we could bring Girard into the conversation. And then, of course, will success for you come with the liquidation of the monster? If that's, what will you do once the monster does that? But, you know, it really is, why do we need why do we need monsters? Why do we need the scapegoat? And then I just wanted to bring in two other points just to broaden the conversation slightly, since I'm the fairy tale expert. I can't help but bring up Beauty and the Beast, which is our cultural story about the other and how you tame, civilize the other with kindness and compassion. And then today we have this counter narrative, Shrek, where, you know, the monster is the hero, and you know, the transfer. What happens? Beauty turns into a monster. So, you know, what about? I'd love to hear what some of you think about that particular story. And then finally, a question too about recent manifestations of monsters. Stranger Things, of course, where you have an entirely new. And you know, there the monster compels us to engage with environmental questions. And so what about that monster and the connection with It, Stephen King's It? That, you know, there's that moment in It where someone sees the monster and says, it's she, and she's pregnant. So the monstrosity of the female, of the pregnant woman. So yeah, those are just, I'd love to hear what some of you think about It and Stranger Things.
I lost track of, would you repeat the first part of your question again?
Oh, the first part just had to do with the question of the eternal monster. Will it ever disappear? Or is there something in our psyche that, you know, we're good, it's some sort of need to create demons? Yeah. I think
that I actually gave a talk at the Cupertino Rotary Club yesterday, and they asked me the same question. Are you trying to work yourself out of a job? And I think that it's a really interesting question. I do believe that in my very preliminary studies into neuroscience, I'm learning about amygdala threat response. And the amygdala very, very quickly determines whether another person is a threat by associating that person with certain traits that you have come to know are negative traits. And this process happens so fast that we think it's instinctive, but it's not. It really draws on a library of imagery that we've generated by experiencing our culture. So we have a lot of negative images of certain types of people in our culture that come through our culture. Those are the images that we use when we're assessing threats. So I think that it is very human, very fundamentally human to monsterize other people. I think it's one of the things that we have to work against very, very profoundly in our work, that if we want to be compassionate and empathetic people, we need to work against it. However, I would sure hate to see monsters disappear altogether, because I love monsters. And what I discovered growing up, and I mentioned that I was asked about my horns. What I discovered growing up was that I was never going to be welcome in that center of the culture. I was never going to be part of things. I was never going to be equal. And so I actually turned towards the monstrous, and I found strength in that identity. I found a certain sense of belonging. I found a certain way of talking about my own peculiarity that gave me power. So I believe, and I've had other encounters with monstrosity over the years that have made me stronger, I think, that have made me more self-aware. And I think that we are always going to seek after those experiences. And when you talk about horror, the initial definition of horror, it's in many ways it's the inverse of awe. It makes you question your role in the universe and the nature of the universe itself, and that could be extremely beneficial. And I think that we seek out those experiences because we think that they are beneficial. It's why we go to horror movies, because we want to be scared, because we want to be shocked out of our complacency for a moment. And I have other things to say about the other questions that you raised, but I want to turn it over to, I think Renee would have some really interesting things to say about these questions.
Yeah, Maria, your question made me think about a novel that I'm reading with a Gothic class that I'm teaching at the moment, called The Beetle from 1897 by a writer named Richard Marsh. And so this was a novel that came out same year Dracula came out. Dracula, not that popular in 1897. The Beetle, the best-selling novel of 1897. And this novel has one of the craziest monster figures that I've ever come across. It's an eternal ancient Egyptian, non-binary, sometimes old, sometimes young character who is sometimes a person and is sometimes a really slimy, smelly beetle that like stickily climbs up people's bodies and sucks onto their faces in ways that are entirely grotesque. And I mean, it is one of the most horrifying monsters that I have come across really anywhere, but especially in 19th century literature. But the thing about this novel is that it spends a lot of time describing this terrible monster. But one of the narrators of this novel, one of our upper class English people who describes the horrors of this monster to us, is sitting in his lab for much of the novel, creating weapons of mass destruction and killing cats as he develops chemical warfare and working on weapons. I mean, he is one of the most evil characters that I've ever come across. And the contrast that this novel offers us between this thing that is obviously supposed to be our monster and this human who is a nightmare, who is absolutely the thing that we should all clearly be terrified of, makes me just think really hard about the problem, both the sort of problem and the possibilities of deciding that the thing that is most obviously or most physically monstrous is the thing that we should be scared of. Actually, what that sort of most horrifying visual monster does for us in this novel is kind of give us a window into something that's much worse, into the ways in which human behavior and human desire and the human impulse towards mass destruction, that's actually the cultural phenomenon that we need to be the most worried about in this text. And it really, I think, calls attention to the ways in which our impulse as humans is to decide that weird smelly beetle thing is the thing that's scary. But if we just look a little bit closer and think a little bit harder, what we'll recognize is that the person is the thing that's scary. The beetle we can deal with, like you shove the beetle aside a little bit, it stops like squelching smellily on your face. But this guy with his weapons of mass destruction, like he is still there and he is still doing his damage. And so, it's not precisely your Beauty and the Beast question, but it makes me think about the ways that that texts across time have worked with that that human versus monster, beauty versus beast dichotomy, and has have inverted them, or have at least drawn our attention to the ways in which our biases continue to produce that dichotomy that isn't really actually a dichotomy. And it can happen in so many ways. I don't think our weapons of mass destruction guy is much of a beauty, but we're supposed to understand him as a good-looking upper-class British man in relation to this terrible beetle creature, and that is not what's actually happening in this novel. That's not what's at stake in this novel. So I think that one of the things that monster literature across time offers us is a kind of regular confrontation with our own biases towards monsterizing, when maybe we need to remember that there are other problems, there are other dangers out there in the world.
I'd like to ask you guys a question, if I can. Just a lot of our audience, a lot of us come from a world of depth psychology. And so for us, there's some certain things that are going to come in and be normal. So I'm sure that a lot of the people watching and that will watch will have some certain thoughts that are just waiting to be voiced. And I wonder if you guys could give us your thoughts on those. And you were starting to bring up some things that were going in that direction. And that is shadow, projection, trauma. So from our kind of, not my point of view, but just kind of from the world we come from, it's very natural for us to see things as a projection of something inside ourselves that is our own shadow being projected outward, a shadow we don't want to look at because of a reason, often because of a trauma that has shape, a shape that ends up looking like what we're projecting out into the world. And so I wonder, like, for you, and I hear a lot of things that y'all are talking about that are going some of these directions. I just wonder how does that feel to you, and how do you feel about this study of psychology being a big part of what y'all are doing, and dream studies, and even, I don't want to say the Jungian world, but we'll stick with projection and shadow and trauma.
One of our failures, failures is we haven't accomplished yet, is getting the psychologists into the Center for Monster Studies. They haven't resisted it. We just haven't reached out to them yet. So, but we definitely want to start getting the cognitive and behavioral psych guys into the mix here, so that they can start telling us a little bit more about these deeper phenomena, what's going on in the human psyche that craves monsters, right? Not just that tolerates monsters, but actually craves them and seeks them out. I think that it's very therapeutic for us to confront monsters, I think, in the way that Renee was just talking about. And if we know what we're doing, right, it can be a dangerous double-edged sword. I think if you don't know what you're doing, you're going to wind up going deeper into that shadow realm, right? But if you do have some self-awareness and some cognizance, then it can actually be really beneficial. Elizabeth,
I'm just going to bug you to answer more. Some of the earlier comments about retaking the monster, thinking about From Beauty and the Beast to Shrek, but also the relationship to form and monster. While we haven't engaged much with the psychologists in the first, our second festival, but the first one called Festival of Monsters, we did have a number of scholars of disability studies.
That's right.
And I wonder if you could reflect on some of what that field tells us about why we monsterize other people around that fear of difference in body, difference in healthiness, because that's something we see today as well.
Absolutely. I think you just said it. I don't need to answer that. I think the answer was embedded in the question, but I see Camilla is also wanting to respond to that. I'll throw it over to Camilla.
So I wanted to jump in because I think I have a slightly different take on this question. I think maybe from my own kind of disciplinary background and training, and also to put my cards on the table, like I'm a Marxist, right? And so I think because of that, I have concerns with psychoanalysis as kind of the primary method that we use to analyze social phenomena, because so often it locates problems within the individual, right? There's an individualizing of what are deeply, deeply structural and kind of world historical systems. that then shape the way that we come to live in and inhabit the world. And even with regard, I think the question of trauma is a really fascinating one, and sort of what we do politically with trauma. And I've thought about this a lot in the context of my classrooms as well. I think in a moment where we see particularly so many of our students kind of coming to understand themselves as political subjects through the lens of trauma. And so, I went back to a scholar whose work is deeply important for me, the historian and Black Studies scholar, Robin D.G. Kelley, who has this great piece called Black Study, Black Struggle. And he is also thinking through the way that in this moment, and trust me, I'll circle back to Monsters, but give me 1 second. He's thinking about a moment when Black students are making demands on the university for transformation through the framework of trauma. And he's thinking through this complicated relationship that he has with the way that trauma is used as the way of articulating ourselves or understanding ourselves as political subjects, but also why it is that trauma gets so much airtime. And so he's quoting Naomi Wallace here, the playwright Naomi Wallace, who says, mainstream America is less threatened by trauma theory because it doesn't place economic justice at its core and takes the focus out of the realm of justice and into psychology, out of the streets, communities, into the singular experience, even if experienced in common, of the individual. And so I think for me, what's so generative in terms of how we think about monsters, how we think about the psychology of monsters and what they tell us about society, is because it actually gives us a way to kind of link these broader structural forces with, I think, the question of interiority and lived experience. So, how do we think about the impulse to monsterize also as itself a product of histories of racial capitalist dispossession and colonialism? Because I think that also gives us a political opening, right? I'm, as a scholar of racism, I always sort of tense up, right, when the explanations are rooted in something that is deep and innate in human psychology, right? An innate fear of the other, right? An innate skepticism of strangers, an inherent human xenophobia. Because if that's what we think that humans are, then what hope do we have? And if anything, one of my beloved mentors says, basically, like, we don't like to generalize about human nature. There are very few things that all humans have always done across history, across all time and space since the dawn of humankind. But if there's one thing that we can actually say, it's that we have an innate curiosity about the other. And so I think framing the psychology of monsters and monsterization within a kind of historical structural grounding helps to get away from what is often an overly individualistic sort of understanding of individual psychology and individual trauma, but also gets us out of this bind of being trapped by a really pessimistic view of human nature.
Well, don't we have our own spin on how we feel marginalized? And that personalization of my own feeling marginalized allows me to empathize with somebody else who feels empathic. I remember when I served in Vietnam, I had an allegiance with a group of young Blacks that were my age who were really being discriminated against on board the ship. Well, as the token hippie in the division, we were both marginalized by the right-wing factions on board the ship. And every universe has conservative elements or people who are part of the power elite. And the few that hold that power, they don't care who they're marginalizing. They want to marginalize everybody that's not them. And so the people who are marginalized together. They may not share the same strand or bandwidth of being marginalized, but they have being marginalized in common.
I think it's, oh, sorry, Camilla, if you want to respond to that, please do.
No, go ahead. I'm mostly just nodding. I'm nodding in agreement, right? That's how we do the work of coalition building. That's how we do the work of solidarity, which is, precisely that. It's not just because these questions are structural also doesn't mean, right, that we don't have our specific interiority, and the work happens like precisely in these moments when we're able to kind of figure out those moments of intersection.
I just wanted to say, I think it's really cool that you guys are able to draw by picking such, we had this great friend, Christophe Lemuel, and he said to me, head of the Young Institute in LA, our executive director, and he said to me one time, he said, by making something really small, by doing one tiny little thing, you're able to participate in everything. When you try to do everything, you end up not being able to. And so by focusing in so much on monsters, you're able to bring in such a interesting richness of conversation. I really appreciate what you had to say about that, Camilla. I think that's, really interesting. I, of course, have thoughts about the large collective psychosis and the way that we can actually literally fall into group spells, and we can really delude ourselves in powerful ways. But what you said at the same time is so interesting, because it's always the history, that does lead into these stories, and very real things, and not just psychological dynamics. Even if psychological dynamics are there to amplify or catch or change or be taken advantage of, it is an easy way to hide behind what's going on in the individual psyche, and to avoid addressing what's going on in a much bigger world. So I think that's really powerful. Thank you.
I'd like to bring in just another aspect. I've spent a lot of time in the last 5 months with James Hollis's book, Hauntings. And I think you'll appreciate the subtitle, Dispelling the Ghosts That Run Our Lives. And I've presented on it a bit in Ireland early in the year. And I'm presenting a couple of workshops on it in the future. But it seems to me that what haunts us, and I'm testing this on you, might fall under the rubric of monstrous. I mean, feeling shame that I'm not good enough feels monstrous. I better not do that because I fear risking anything. Feels monstrous. I'm stuck in a resentment from when I was 22. Feels monstrous. So I wonder if the hauntings, the ghostly quality of hauntings can find a place within the monstrous frame. Yeah.
Yeah, I think we used to talk about the demon of external validation, or the demon of low self-esteem, right? We find a way to once again map those monstrous traits onto the things that cause us anxiety, right? Whatever those things are, they're capable of filling those vessels that you described earlier, right? And we could talk about nowadays we could talk about the demon of internalized racism, for instance, right?
Yeah, good.
The way that I think Camilla brings in that discussion about our hesitation about getting too psychological with our work as a way of avoiding dealing with real world problems, right?
That's right.
Yeah, but I do think that anything that produces anxiety can find its way into a monster shell.
Yeah.
Right.
That's helpful. Thank you.
Yeah.
There's also the title of that book also reminds me of the work of the theorist Avery Gordon, right, who's also a theorist of hauntings. And, similarly, right, thinking about, how does, for example, the history of slavery continue to haunt the contemporary, and also in ways that, again, kind of challenge these very liberal ideas that we take for granted of like the unitary self-sovereign subject, right, where I'm consciously making all of these decisions about what I do and choosing who I am and how I act in the world. But this is kind of another way of saying that there are these forces that we can't necessarily see, but these deeply historically sedimented forces that shape our world and how we move through it.
Yes. And what is it that Setha early in Beloved says when Paul D returns, and this pulsing red light, which is the presence of the one daughter that she was able to slay, and she becomes exasperated with him, who is wanting to cleanse this place of what's haunting it. And Setha says, and it's been a while since I've read the novel, but she says something like, I got a haint on my back from the scars, but also from her history. and something else. So don't bother me with your talk, she says to Paul D. And I never forgot that line of her feeling that haint on her back, which has no feeling because she was whipped so badly that she lost the nerves, lost all feeling. And that haint has kept her at 124 Bluestone Road for 15 years, 18 years. Yeah, stuck because of the haunting. Yeah, just magnificent.
It's so interesting. What you said, Camilla, about curiosity as maybe an antidote to some of these things that we see in human nature as being eternal. Investigative curiosity, wanting to know more, to do the work. And the other way to react is with fear. But I guess I would ask the question, I have a sense almost that there's a bifurcation of monstrosity, of monsters here, that on the one hand, we have the monster, Michael, that you talked about, you identified with the monster, Shrek, and the outsider. You start to appreciate your role as being the outsider, as being so quirky or queer, or all of those terms that we use to describe the person who is not a conformist. But then there's also the monster, and we see this, we saw it today. What do we do? I mean, we react with fear to a shooter. How do we manage all the anxieties that come? I mean, is there a way that we can empathize, understand, bring curiosity to the table? Or how do we process that? How are we processing it today? How do we keep ourselves from creating demons out there?
Well, I think, Michael, as you brought up with the wandering Jew, we create demons and monsters because first they work, and secondly, can we help ourselves? If you need something to project upon a group of people, even if it's an inaccurate monster, like the thing with Osama, it had all of the benchmarks. They hit every note on that, and it still worked. Nobody said, well, we don't believe that's accurate, because they've taken the wandering Jew and they've overlaid it on Osama bin Laden. But it works because we're vulnerable to quick, easy solutions.
Yes, I think that's exactly right. Is we go for the easy solution, and the easy solution is always anger, fear, and hatred, right? Mm-hmm. It's so much easier.
Well, and it's also declaration. It's defining. And when we define something, we're trying to, I think, get some power over it before we destroy it. Curiosity doesn't typically give us much power. It's a very vulnerable place to be curious. And I think it's hard to be vulnerable when we're afraid.
Absolutely. Yeah.
But I also think that, there is an impulse to, to do this monsterizing. But one of the things that has been pretty pervasive, especially across, I would say, the last, probably the last 50 or 60 years of, at least of literature, is that we are also desperate to humanize the monster. Like we want to monsterize humans, but we want to humanize monsters. Dracula in 1897 is not like Dracula in 1992. These are very different versions of the same character. And one of the things that happens when we get to, Francis Ford Coppola's version of Dracula that we absolutely don't get it 100 years before is we get a monster who is given an origin story, and who's given a set of reasons, and who's given motives, and who's given desire in a profoundly human way, and who is given a complicated interiority. And so, as much as we want to say that that people in the world around us are monsters, we also want to make monsters a version of humans. We want to make them something with which we can identify, and that that desire to identify is maybe the equal and opposite reaction to our desire to use tropes of monstrosity or ideas of monstrosity to distance ourselves from from people or ideas that are complicated or make us feel uncomfortable. And I feel like those two desires, the desire to distance and the desire to identify, are working kind of always in relation to one another.
I want to work backwards from what you said, back to that question of, what if we ever got rid of all the monsters? And one of the things that's on my mind is that they're all memories. And in sometimes that's all that's left of a certain memory. Is I think about, like, if the women in Europe had just submitted, would we even have a story of the witch? If the women that were abducted, like Medea, would we even have the story? But we do have that witch now because they did. And in some way that's what's left. And you would have all, I wish I could have invited you. Last year, I got an anthropology class thrown onto my plate that I wasn't really able to fully handle. And I had to find a way to teach this class while doing a million other things. And I was doing interviews on for this TV show on zombies and witches, different episodes. And so I thought to myself, okay, I stumbled backwards across some of what y'all are doing. And I ended up using these monsters as units in my anthropology course. And my students are, Maria knows, they're all artists, dancers, actors, musical theater majors, filmmakers. And so they did monster projects. They did, they were witches, they were zombies. They went into the Haitian stories, they went into the Cleopatras, and it was, they could sink their teeth into that like nothing I had ever seen. They could get into it with their art, with their playfulness, but also they all found memories in the Haitian voodoo stories of the zombies, in the witches, in the Cleopatras of the world, and all of them found power in those memories and play and community. It was, I will have to look to see if I can find any of those recordings to share with you, because it was very inspiring. And so I want to go back to that part where we're healing these monsters eventually, maybe in some way. To me, it points back to when the memory was formed and preserved, even in that monstrous form.
I think that's a beautiful way to articulate that phenomena, Will. Thank you so much for sharing that. I think, my students also are artists, most of them. Usually they're performers. Although for my monsters class, I get hundreds of students from all sections of the university. Crazy, just can come in and do this. But I think, I think that there was a very moving way of describing that phenomenon. I wanted to address really briefly this notion about about humanizing the monster, right? And I think that this trend begins in the 1960s. I think the first story of a monster, or a heroic story that's told from the point of view of the monster, is John Gardner's Grendel. Grendel by John Gardner. I mixed that up somehow. This is the story of Beowulf told from the point of view of Grendel. And shortly after that, we had Jesus Christ Superstar, which is the Gospel of John told from the point of view of Judas, right? And now we have Wicked, which is the story of the Wizard of Oz told from the point of view of the witch. And I think Renee also reminded me about Twilight and Vampire Diaries and True Blood and all these motions where we're identifying with monsters. We want to see ourselves in them. We want to see our stories played out in this monstrous language. So I think that's one of the things that monsters do is they give us a language for processing our own experiences. Not just fear, not just anger, not just hate, but hope as well, and aspiration and struggle, right? So I do think that's a powerful observation.
Well, and one more thing, Michael, is it, and I'm addressing you and Renee, because it seems like the monster invites its opposite, like any good archetype.
Yes.
Once the archetype is formed, it's going to move in that enantiodromia to its opposite. And then there can be a very healthy tension between the two. It's not erasing this part of it or that part of it, but holding that tension of opposites. Maybe that's where compassion and empathy play their role in allowing that tension of opposites to be sustained.
Yes.
Yeah.
Jeffrey Cohen writes a wonderful essay about Frankenstein, in which he talks about the concept of the very etymology of the word creature is not that which has been created, but that which is being created. And the creature is always in a relationship, a dynamic tension with the creator. And they are, in fact, creating each other constantly. And they don't exist as poles on opposite sides of a discourse, but in fact in an interspace where they're. I mean, I'm citing Deleuze now, and bringing Deleuze into this conversation, but a space that is a meta space, a space of aggregation, a space of assemblage, and a space where there is a potential for tremendous becoming to occur, right? So yes.
And so could I add a place of relation?
Yes.
That it's not a gap. It's a place of energy transfer from my point of view, and it's a shared relational moment. Yeah,
absolutely.
Since we brought Deleuze into the conversation, can I bring Nietzsche in?
Sure.
I mean, really, we're talking about a transvaluation of values. This sort of reversal where the monster becomes the hero. I thought, Michael, as you were speaking, I thought of The Shape of Water.
That's a perfect example. I use that in my class all the time.
Yeah. Where actually you have someone who is curious about the monster, wants to know more, gets to, I mean, in a way it's a Beauty and the Beast story, but, completely reshaped, redone. And I mean, it is interesting that you see in the rewriting of fairy tales today, everyone's flipping the script. And, that, why is that happening now? And it is a phenomenon of the last couple of decades.
Yeah, Maria, I was just what I was thinking about when Dennis was talking was Angela Carter. Like that was the first thing that came into my mind, the Bloody Chamber, and the idea that the Frankenstein story is always a kind of dialogue between creator and creation, but also in all of these rewritings of fairy tales, like that same dynamic is at hand between the 18th or 19th century versions and the way these contemporary writers are reimagining the monsters as heroes, or are reimagining reimagining Little Red Riding Hood as the big bad wolf, and making that a kind of feminist anthem that that there's nothing that I don't know, kind of gives more satisfaction than flipping the script exactly, and telling those old stories from completely new points of view. And I mean, Angela Carter did it astoundingly, and then everyone else has done it since, and they flip the script in many of the same ways, and they're still satisfying. Like I still want to read those stories.
It seems to me that in many world cultures, indigenous, African, Caribbean, there are, I'll say, representatives like shaman, orishas, or what have you, who have this ability to communicate with the dark side, to represent the community to the field of uncertainty, whether it's beyond life or whether it's beyond the understanding of things that happen, or it's wanting to know the reasons for things. We don't seem to have that in, I'll call it, white patriarchal culture. If anything, we transfer it onto our politicians and religious leaders to figure out what are the meanings of things. But we don't go into the substrata of what the human psyche is actually experiencing. So curiosity isn't where we go. We go to wanting answers. what do these cultures, like there was a book that I read on Caribbean mythology called The Signifying Monkey. And I mean, it just blew me away because it was one of these things that I hadn't read something like that before. And it had to do with the wisdom that comes through both the non-human, but the threshold personalities that represent the service of the community. How do we keep these things alive in our culture? Is it through education? Is it through curiosity? Is it through ritual? Is it through understanding the power of analogical thinking or symbology? I just put that out there and say, you know, teaching categories and black and white things doesn't get us there.
Absolutely. I think that it's a very Western phenomenon that monsters represent pure evil and heroes represent pure good. And I think that part of the cultural shift that Maria was just talking about, where we start identifying with monsters, has to do with a dissatisfaction with that binary way of thinking, a rejection of, for lack of a better word, white patriarchal culture that imposes a certain set of moralities, which are highly binary, right? If you look at monsters in Asia, for instance, you're going to see monsters that are essential, that are absolutely necessary to the operation of the cosmos, monsters that generate wisdom, very important wisdom that you need to survive and to live well, monsters that are multi-layered, right? And that have, as Renee said, backstories and reasons for being, and that are part of the natural world and the cosmic world, right? In a very positive way. And so they often wind up playing the villainous roles, but not always. If you look at Journey to the West, for instance, which is a very important text in Asia, the main character, the Monkey King or monkey, Hanuman, has got these buddies that go along with him, Sandy and Piggy.
Mm-hmm.
These are monsters. They were human flesh-eating monsters before they started traveling around with him, right? And so they got rehabilitated into his service and through his friendship. And he himself is very monstrous as a character, right? The Arabian Nights, for instance, another very important text, right, in which you've got the jinn characters, and they're very complex. They have their own societies, their own nations, their own politics. So yeah, I mean, I think it's a very Western phenomenon that we fall into this trap that the monster is always and already evil, and something that needs to be exterminated.
I love that, Michael, and it reminds me. So I have been performing in this, Halloween themed show with the circus company that I occasionally perform with, and I was the MC, so I've been sort of narrating all of the acts, providing introductions, and one of the acts is a sort of a group of contortionists called the Slither Sirens. And so, in sort of where I was researching snakes, I was researching the mythology of snakes. And the global mythology of snakes is so fascinating because we see within the same myths how snakes are simultaneously monstrous, but also givers of life. They represent sickness, they represent rebirth. So many creation myths involve snakes, and they sort of sit in all of these complicated places. They are, the theme of the show was weaving the liminal, right? And snakes are sort of these quintessentially liminal creatures, right? Who are constantly remaking themselves as they shed their skins, and they're swallowing the world and giving birth to the world. But one thing I want to say, and Michael, I totally agree that this sort of binaristic thinking is so profoundly Western. And then we can historicize that too, because the idea of the West is a relatively recent invention, right? Stuart Hall says the West is not a place, it's an historical construct. And the West emerges, around the end of the 15th century, this idea of the West as a place that, again, is tied to, right, the Inquisition and the expulsion of the Moors and these voyages of discovery. But that, you know, if we sort of think about sort of what was happening before the consolidation of this category of the West as white, Christian, shared civilization, we also see all of these other kinds of myths and traditions, even within Europe. But I think what we really see, it's the Enlightenment, right? It's colonialism. It's this notion of mastery, right? And categorization, right? This sort of imperative to fully know and categorize the other that we can also historicize as tied to this sort of world historical moment of conquest and acquisition.
Thank you so much for bringing that up, Camilla, because immediately when I started thinking about Western mythology, especially thinking pre-1500s, you think of the fairy. That's a monster with many layers that can do good and ill, can take your time, can take your life, can take your children, and yet is in some traditions, a respected or offered to mythological creature. And some might not think fairy are monsters, but I think they fit the bill exactly. And that's an example of a non-binary Western monster, but that has its roots pre this determination of the construct of the West. And I think it would be fun to bring in some speakers on the topics related to sort of our current political structure and the change of the monster, maybe for next year's festival.
Absolutely. That sounds like a great idea. I spent some time in Norway, and some of the old beliefs in Norway are still simmering just under the surface. In pre-Christian Europe, I think there was a much more expansive vision of monsters and fairies in particular, right, or fae in particular. But in Norway, I noticed that there's a place where they built a highway to go around a rock, a particular rock, and it's because there's a tradition that there's a monster that lives in that rock. And nobody wanted to disturb that monster, right? They wanted to try and live still in harmony with the figures that they believe embody the natural world and the unnatural world.
I have a question for this is so interesting to just even almost field to field conversations, the way this is starting to feel sometimes. One thing that I'm curious about how your camp, how your group would respond to things like one of the things we haven't talked about is how the actual shapes of these monsters end up the unique shapes that they are. You know, like, for example, one that really took me with its obviousness is Bigfoot, because it's so obvious that it represents our relationship to our own inner animal or something like that. We want to deny it. We want to say it doesn't exist. Even this is part of the way that it's all put together. We end up pushing it out to the outside of civilization because that's where our animal belongs, et cetera, et cetera. So I wonder, like, for us, this is where we end up, we're in a world of pattern recognition, you know, recurring patterns. This pattern in this character is also there, and this person is also there, and society is also there, and this historical experience, et cetera. So I wonder, how do you come at, or are you interested in, or where does your interest go when it comes to the unique shapes and patterns, in the meanings of these shapes and patterns in these monsters?
This isn't really an answer to that question so much as an anecdotal version of saying absolutely. One of the things that Michael and I kept noticing as we were putting together this exhibition on monsters and women's comic art was that octopuses were everywhere. Like all of a sudden, you know, there would be these comic books that were full of other monsters, unique monsters, different monsters, aliens, all sorts of things. And then all of a sudden a random octopus would just leap out of the water and, like, you know, try to smother somebody.
I saw it in the corner of the presentation. So thank you for now explaining this story.
And they would just, you know, they would just show up, and it you know, an octopus is not a monster, it's an animal, but they were being presented in these comic books as this kind of completely kind of like inexplicably monstrous force that, you know, couldn't really be part of whatever the political, the politics of the comic was, that weren't really part of the story. They were, they were expressive of, certain natural forces that were uncontainable or unstoppable. They were representative of certain kinds of randomness, just the random possibilities of horror kind of bursting from the boundaries, or bursting out of the water. And it happens over and over and over again from the 1940s through the contemporary moment. And, the octopus has all sorts of, its own political resonances, especially in anti-Semitic discourse in the 1940s and 50s. You see the octopus as a kind of anti-Semitic representation of Jewish reach. So, there are ways that you could probably read that particular iconography into comic books, but mostly what that repetitive image is a kind of image of random horror, and the ways in which random horror can just impinge on the world that you are living in, or the ways in which nature itself can kind of suddenly burst out of the corner of your world and have the potential to destroy you. But just to again, octopus not a monster, but that constant image, you start seeing it over and over again, and you start recognizing that that it's doing something unique. It has a particular purpose. Once you see those patterns, or see those kind of moments of repetition, or some kind of iconographic repetition, you have to sort of stop and say, okay, like, I'm seeing this over and over again. What is it doing? What kind of work is it trying to accomplish? How am I supposed to read this? What am I supposed to do with it? Can I read it? Is it even possible?
Thank you. That's exactly what I wanted to ask, because it's like there's an immediate poetry. It's just immediate. Zombies are dead matter. So it draws in our relationship with the world as dead matter. And so it ends up a story representing our philosophy and our relationship to nature as dead. And so it ends up this horror story of our own philosophy that is, materialistic, reductive. Then we objectify matter, we objectify bodies, women, et cetera, But that's where another direction I just wanted to make sure we touched on in this conversation about monsters, which is just the immediate poetry of the monsters, their immediate qualities and the patterns and shapes they point us to, whether they're damaging or profound or whatever they are, just the patterns themselves. And so that's awesome. And that's really interesting about the zombie. About the octopus. I did not know about the anti-Semitic part of that. And that is probably where the piece I don't understand about Cthulhu and why people are critical of him. I'll have to go look that up. But thank you. That's exactly what I was hoping you would help us get into.
I mean, also Lovecraft was like a horrific anti-Black racist. So he just checked off the boxes for all of the racisms. Love for Lovecraft, like Lovecraftian horror is like at its core, it's a kind of racial terror, which I think is why it's been so fascinating to see, in particular, Black creatives reclaiming and reworking Lovecraft from, Lovecraft Country to N.K. Jemisin's The City We Became, to really like take Lovecraft and like turn him on his head, basically.
Yeah, and
that's a really interesting one. That's just crazy, because that's not the same as just flipping the witch, into a positive thing. That's a whole different thing when people are taking that one back. I didn't want to interrupt you, Michael, please, but that was really shocking.
Well, yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, I think but you bring up zombies, and I think one of the things I teach my students is this process called monstrogenealogy, where you take a look at how the monster manifests over time and across cultures. Mm-hmm. And that gives you some sense of how that culture is feeling about different things that are generating anxiety, right? For instance, nobody is afraid anymore of the Emphis Bena or the Firdarig, right? Nobody's worried about the Firdarig coming to get you anymore. Whatever it was that it embodied as a monster is no longer scary to us. But the zombie, you bring up the zombie, and the zombie has mutated over time. The zombie appears for the first time shortly after the Haitian slave revolt. Did you know that? Zombies are actually a subclass of a certain type of slave that had become so dehumanized, so much a cog in the machine of slavery, that they would just work and they would just drop where they would work until they dropped, and then they would sleep on the ground wherever they were. They would get up and they didn't talk, and they would just like robotically go through these motions. And it was that class of slave that rose up against their masters and generated this this country, right? It was a successful slave revolt. And that's when the zombie as a monster starts showing up in American, specifically in American stories. And so I believe that it's very clear that that's a misplaced anxiety, not about the dead, but about the way that we treat members of our own society, right? And the way that we exploit them for their labor and whatnot. And over time, that shape, the zombie, changes to embody other things. In the 50s, it was communism, right? It was the fear of Russian-style communism coming in and getting us. And then after a while, it became about disease, right? But when you look at it now, and it's about this, the zombie is really caught up in a fear of globalism, because we see these stories about a ship comes into Atlanta and it's full of zombies, and the zombies come out and they start infecting everybody, and that's how they have The Walking Dead. And it's once again a fear of a racial other. Once again, so that zombie always contains that little sort of core, which is a fear of the racial other that somehow always appears in zombie stories, even though the zombies themselves transform dramatically over time. One of the things that my students always point out is like, why did zombies become fast? And it was because slow zombies weren't scary anymore, so they became fast.
Are these stories always told from the point of view of white male patriarchy?
No, certainly not. I think, this is just a very small subset of monster culture that we're looking at here today, but I think that there's a much wider range. I had a student who was descended from Naga. She was from South India, and she had descended from a group of people who believed, who held very strongly this tradition that they had been descended from snake creatures, from Naga, and that the snake creatures were very spiritually powerful, and she was a scientist. And people would ask her, how can you believe both of those things? And she would say, well, it's not that hard, really, if you have an imagination.
And Michael, have we seen yet the zombie story from the point of view of a zombie?
Yes.
Oh, we have. Okay.
Yeah, a couple of stories. There was one called Warm Bodies, which was a story between it was a Romeo and Juliet story. The female character was a human named Juliet, and the Romeo character was a zombie named Arr. And he was a zombie until he saw her for the first time, and then his heart started to beat again. And there was a TV show that I liked a lot called I Zombie.
Yeah, isn't she she's a zombie, but she's a forensic pathologist, and by eating the brains of these murder victims, she could solve their murders.
Oh my gosh. What was the title?
I Zombie.
I love how goofy monster stuff gets.
It can get goofy.
Thank you.
Are these stories, do they have broader appeal across genders, or is it mostly males or mostly females, or is equal? Pretty much.
Oh, am I unmuted? Yeah. Yes, I can't speak to the demographic specifically, but across scholarship and fandom, you'll find that there's a great embrace from not only thinking about the binary of male or female, or even heterosexual love. There's so many queer lenses to analyze the monster. Number of scholars writing about all kinds of monsters into that lens, especially the vampire, of course, recently. I'm sure Renee could tell us a lot more about that than I can, but I can say that the way that we're framing the monster has an appeal to anyone who has felt like the other. And some of these retelling stories look at a feminine lens. We had a keynote speaker for FrankenCon, Kirsten White, who wrote a young adult novel, The Dark Descent of Elizabeth Frankenstein. Frankenstein told from Elizabeth's perspective as a frame for white women's complicity in the evil of the patriarchy. It's a fascinating read. I ate it all up and was so fun to talk to that author.
Yeah.
But I would say that that book is for everyone, but we're seeing more of these non-binary and women characters in monster stories in these retaking sort of tales. Not to do with, I think, a great change in the audience, but just the increase in opportunities that we have to have a more diverse field of authors and creators.
Well, I saw that at the Festival of Monsters conference, that I just thought the breadth of approaches from the various panels. Now, that may have been your doing in terms of putting those panels together, but boy, I tell you, I mean, it just surprised me to no end. That just when you think you're there, then the next panel has got something totally different, and it was beautifully presented and staged as a well, I hope it's I know it's going to be an annual event. I mean, that was just it was so well received. So
Thank you, Dana. We're raising money now for next year.
well, we'll talk about that.
Dana, before we wrap up, I feel like I've seen Maria have a thought that I want to know what it is. Maria, was there something that you wanted to add? Oh, you're on mute. Maria, you're on mute.
Sorry. You know, I actually was thinking about animals, totem animals and hybrids and chimeras and all, and the conversation has gone into a new fascinating direction. So, yeah.
I feel like I'm just lapping it up because of my curiosity. And I felt that at your Festival of Monsters. I mean, they're just one person after another was so well schooled in terms of the whole, everything about it. It was fabulous. So I would like to close by thanking everybody for participating in this. Michael, Elizabeth, Camilla, Renee, and there's Dennis, wonderful. Maria, I always blank at this point, and then Will. What a wonderful way to close out the day and go into the dark of the night. I do like to go out with a moment of silence. I hope you all will come back again, and I'll keep you on our email list. I mean, we do an awful lot of really interesting things in this Myth Salon, but it's through scholarship like what you bring that the world of education, it creates curiosity. I just find that curiosity is sustainable. You can reach a limit to your understanding, but not to your curiosity. So I thank you all very much, and thank you all for participating. I thank all of the audience who showed up for this. This has been a beautiful, beautiful day. So, all right.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for having us. It was a real pleasure.
Thank you so much.
Really.
Thank you.
And
all.
happy Halloween.
Happy Halloween.
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 All
Rich
right.
conversation. Thank you all.
Really.
Wow.
Good night.
Dennis.
Good night.
Night. Bye-bye.
Good night, y'all.